the millionaire's son married the maid of his mansion against his father's will. As the ceremony ended, something happened that left everyone speechless. Michael Harrison stood by the large window in his father's mansion, staring out at the sprawling estate that stretched far beyond the horizon. The world around him was built on wealth, power, and control. Control that his father, William Harrison, exerted over every aspect of his life. As the heir to the family empire, Michael had always been expected to follow the path laid out for him. Marry a suitable woman from a wealthy family, continue the Harrison legacy, and grow the empire even more. But the weight of those expectations had become unbearable. His thoughts drifted to Emma, the woman who had turned his life upside down. Emma was nothing like the women his father had chosen for him. She was a simple, kind-hearted woman who worked as a housekeeper in their mansion. Despite her humble background, Emma possessed a strength and warmth that Michael had never encountered in the high society circles he was forced to navigate. She didn't care about his money or his family's power. She cared about him, for who he truly was. The sound of footsteps approaching snapped him out of his thoughts. His father's imposing figure entered the room. William was a man who commanded respect with every step, his presence suffocating. He stood tall, his graying hair perfectly combed, his expensive suit tailored to perfection. "Michael," William said in his usual authoritative tone, "we need to discuss your future." Michael turned to face him, already knowing where this conversation was headed. "We've had this discussion before, Dad," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not marrying someone for the sake of the family business." William's eyes narrowed, his voice cold. "You're not thinking straight. You have responsibilities to this family, to the empire I've built." "I don't care about the empire." Michael's frustration boiled over. "I care about Emma. I love her." The name seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken tension. William's expression darkened. "Emma? That girl is beneath you, Michael. You're a Harrison. You don't throw your life away for a housekeeper." Michael clenched his fists, trying to contain his anger. "She's more than that. She's everything to me. And whether you like it or not, I'm going to marry her." For a moment, there was silence, the air thick with the weight of defiance. William stared at his son, his face hard as stone. Then, with a deep breath, he spoke again, his voice laced with contempt. "If you go through with this, Michael, I will disown you. You'll lose everything, your inheritance, your position in the company, all of it. You'll be nothing." Michael didn't flinch. He had expected this ultimatum, but it didn't scare him anymore. "Then I guess I'll be nothing," he said quietly. "But at least I'll have Emma." William's eyes blazed with fury, but Michael didn't wait for his father's response. He turned on his heel and left the room, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked through the grand hallways of the mansion, memories of his privileged upbringing flashed through his mind. Lavish parties, elite gatherings, endless conversations about money and power. None of it mattered to him anymore. All that mattered was Emma. Later that evening, Michael found himself standing in the small garden behind the mansion, the cool night air calming his nerves. He pulled out his phone and dialed Emma's number, his heart racing as he waited for her to pick up. "Michael." Her soft voice came through the line, and he felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Emma," he began, his voice steady. "I need to see you. There's something I need to ask you." They arranged to meet in the staff quarters, a place where Michael had spent countless hours sneaking away from his family's world to be with her. When he arrived, Emma was already waiting, her eyes filled with concern. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping closer to him. Michael took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. "I asked my father for his blessing," he said. "He refused. He threatened to disown me if I marry you." Emma's face fell, but she didn't say anything. She knew how much Michael's family meant to him, how much pressure he was under. "But none of that matters," Michael continued, his voice firm. "Emma, I love you, and I don't care what I have to give up." I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Michael, are you sure? I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." "You're not the reason," Michael said, stepping closer and taking her hands in his. "You're the reason I've found everything that actually matters." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small ring from his pocket. It wasn't extravagant like the ones his family would have approved of, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. "Emma," he said, his voice full of emotion, "will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, unable to speak. She pulled him to his feet, wrapping her arms around him in a tight embrace. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yes, I will." Michael held her close, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had made his choice, and he knew it was the right one. But as they stood there together, the weight of the consequences loomed in the distance, waiting to crash down on them. The next morning, Michael woke up with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He was free from the shackles of his father's expectations, and he had Emma by his side. Nothing else mattered. As he got dressed, his mind wandered back to the moment when she had said yes, her tears of joy filling his heart with a new kind of happiness. But he knew it wasn't over. William Harrison wasn't the kind of man to let things go easily. Michael had barely stepped into the main hall of the mansion when he saw his father waiting for him. William was sitting at the head of the long dining table, his face set in a hard expression, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. It was a stance Michael had come to recognize. His father was preparing for a fight. "Sit down, Michael," William commanded, his voice low but firm. Michael hesitated for a moment before taking a seat across from his father. The tension between them was palpable, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I heard you were with her again last night," William said, breaking the silence. "Emma?" Michael nodded, refusing to let his father intimidate him. "I asked her to marry me. She said yes." William's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You really intend to throw everything away for that girl? You're willing to ruin your future over this ridiculous infatuation?" "It's not ridiculous," Michael replied, his voice steady. "And it's not an infatuation. I love her." William let out a harsh laugh. "Love? Love is a weakness, Michael. It blinds people, makes them do foolish things. You're a Harrison. You don't have the luxury of being foolish." Michael's temper flared. "No, Dad. What's foolish is living your life according to someone else's rules. Your rules. I'm done being controlled by you. I'm done living a life that isn't mine." William's expression darkened, his hands curling into fists on the table. "You're making a mistake. You have no idea what you're giving up. You think you love this girl, but love doesn't pay the bills, Michael. It doesn't build empires. It doesn't last." Michael stood up, his anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Maybe I don't care about building empires. Maybe I just want to be happy." William stood as well, towering over his son. "You have no idea what happiness is. You've lived in this world of privilege your entire life, sheltered from reality. What do you think will happen when the money runs out, when you're left with nothing but your so-called love?" "I guess I'll find out," Michael shot back. "But at least I won't be living under your thumb." For a moment, William said nothing. He just stared at his son, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I've given you everything, Michael. Every opportunity, every advantage. And this is how you repay me, by throwing it all away for some housekeeper." Michael clenched his fists at his sides, trying to hold back the tide of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "This isn't about repayment. This is about my life, my choices." William's face twisted in anger. "Then make your choice, but know this. If you marry her, you're done. I will cut you off from everything. No money, no inheritance, no place in the company. You'll be nothing, just like her." The venom in his father's words stung, but Michael didn't flinch. He had made his decision. I'd rather have nothing with Emma than everything with you." William's eyes blazed with fury, but Michael didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the dining room, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of his father's voice followed him as he left. "You'll regret this, Michael. Mark my words." Michael didn't stop. He didn't even turn around. He kept walking, his resolve hardening with each step. He knew his father would never understand, never accept that there were things more important than money and power. But that was fine. Michael didn't need his father's approval anymore. He had Emma, and that was enough. Later that afternoon, Michael and Emma sat in the modest cafe where they had often met in secret. It was a quiet place, tucked away from the busy streets, a world far removed from the grandeur of the Harrison estate. Emma stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her brow furrowed with worry. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly, breaking the silence. "Your father, he won't let this go." Michael reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "It doesn't matter what he does. We're going to get married. Nothing he says or does will change that." Emma looked down at their joined hands, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me." "You're not making me lose anything," Michael said firmly. "You're giving me something I've never had, freedom." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "Michael, I love you. I really do. But I don't want to be the reason you lose your family. Maybe we should—" "No," Michael interrupted, squeezing her hand. "Don't say it. We're not giving up on this. We've come too far." Emma hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Okay, we'll do it. We'll get married." A small smile tugged at the corner of Michael's lips. "We'll keep it simple. Just us, a few friends, somewhere quiet. It doesn't need to be anything fancy." Emma smiled back, though there was still a trace of worry in her eyes. "I just want to be with you." "Then that's all that matters," Michael said softly. "We'll get through this together." As they sat there, holding hands in the little cafe, the world outside continued to turn. But for Michael and Emma, this was the only world that mattered. A world where love was stronger than money, and where they could build their future, no matter the cost. The days passed quickly, and before long, Michael and Emma were deep in preparations for their wedding. It wasn't the extravagant, high society affair that Michael's family had envisioned for him. Instead, it was intimate, personal, everything that Michael and Emma wanted it to be. There would be no luxurious ballroom, no endless guest list of wealthy elites. Just a small ceremony in a modest church on the outskirts of Boston, surrounded by a few close friends and the household staff who had become like family to them. Despite the simplicity of their plans, there was an undercurrent of tension in every decision. William Harrison had made his threats clear, and though Michael had assured Emma that they didn't need his father's approval, the shadow of William's influence loomed over them. Emma sat at a small table in her modest apartment, carefully addressing invitations by hand. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wrote, her mind wandering back to the confrontation between Michael and his father. She couldn't shake the fear that somehow William would find a way to ruin their happiness. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost, and she knew he wasn't going to let Michael go so easily. Just as she sealed another envelope, a knock at the door startled her. She stood up quickly, her heart racing as she walked to the door. When she opened it, she was met with the familiar face of Michael, holding a small bouquet of flowers. His presence immediately brought her a sense of calm. "Thought I'd stop by and see how the wedding planning's going," Michael said with a grin, handing her the flowers. Emma smiled, taking the bouquet and breathing in the sweet scent of the roses. "It's going okay, I think. Just trying to keep it simple." Michael stepped inside, glancing around the room at the small piles of invitations and notes. "You're doing an amazing job. I know it's not easy with everything." Emma's smile faded slightly, and she set the flowers down on the table. "I just keep thinking about your father. What if he tries something? I don't want our wedding day to be ruined. Michael moved closer, gently taking her hands in his. He's not going to ruin anything. This is our day, Emma. Nothing he does can take that away from us. She looked into his eyes, searching for reassurance. But what if... No what ifs, Michael interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. We're going to get married, and it's going to be perfect. My father doesn't control my life anymore. Emma sighed, leaning into him as he wrapped his arms around her. I want to believe that. Then believe it, he whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. We're going to be fine. Despite Michael's confidence, Emma couldn't help but worry. She had seen the way William looked at her, like she was nothing more than a problem to be solved, an obstacle in his son's life. And though Michael had broken free from his father's control, Emma feared that William's reach extended further than either of them realized. Meanwhile, back at the Harrison mansion, William sat in his study, staring out the window at the manicured gardens below. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, anger swirling just beneath the surface. Michael had defied him, chosen a woman far beneath his station, and now planned to throw his life away with a wedding that would disgrace the family name. He couldn't allow it. William's assistant, a man named Gregory, entered the room quietly, carrying a tray with a glass of whiskey. Sir, he said, setting the glass down on the desk. There's still time to stop this. The wedding hasn't happened yet. William didn't respond immediately. He simply stared out the window, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. I've tried reason. I've tried threats. But Michael is too blinded by this girl. Gregory nodded, standing silently as William continued. There's only one way to end this, William said, his tone hardening. Emma, if she's gone, this nonsense ends. Michael will have no choice but to come to his senses. Gregory hesitated, his brow furrowing. Sir, are you suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, William interrupted, his eyes narrowing. I'm stating a fact. Without her, Michael has nothing. Gregory stood still, unsure of how to respond. He knew better than to question William Harrison when he had made up his mind. But there was something chilling about the way he spoke, as though Emma were nothing more than a piece of a puzzle that needed to be removed. I'll handle it, William said, dismissing Gregory with a wave of his hand. Make sure no one finds out. Gregory nodded, quickly leaving the room. As the door closed behind him, William leaned back in his chair, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't want to resort to drastic measures, Kaz, but his hand had been forced. He wouldn't let his son destroy everything he had built, not for some girl. Back at Emma's apartment, Michael helped her finish the last of the invitations. As they sat together on the couch, exhausted but content, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. He glanced at Emma, who was laughing softly at a memory she was sharing, and he smiled. In this moment, everything felt right. But deep down, Michael knew his father wasn't done. William Harrison never gave up easily, and the battle wasn't over yet. As the sun set outside the window, casting a warm orange glow over the room, Michael leaned over and kissed Emma's forehead. We're going to be okay, he whispered. Emma smiled up at him, her eyes soft and full of love. I know, she whispered back. But even as they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, the storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. The day of the wedding arrived, and a quiet anticipation hung in the air. The small church on the outskirts of Boston stood nestled between trees, its simple architecture a far cry from the grandeur of the Harrison estate. It was exactly what Michael and Emma wanted: intimate, peaceful, free from the burdens of high society. As Michael stood in front of the mirror in the small dressing room adjacent to the chapel, adjusting the collar of his shirt, he felt an unfamiliar sense of calm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't worried about appearances, wealth, or family expectations. All that mattered was Emma, and in a few short minutes, she would walk down that aisle and become his wife. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and his best friend, Jack, stepped into the room. Jack had known Michael since they were kids, back when life was simpler and the future wasn't weighed down by the weight of legacy. "Nervous?" Jack asked, leaning against the doorframe with a grin. Michael smirked, shaking his head. "Not really, I'm more ready." Jack raised an eyebrow. "That's a first. I don't think I've ever seen you this sure about anything." Michael chuckled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, Emma has that effect on me." Jack's smile faded slightly, and he stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Look, Mike, I don't want to ruin the mood, but are you sure your dad's not going to try something today?" Michael's jaw tightened. He hadn't heard from William in days, and while part of him hoped that meant his father had given up, he knew better. William Harrison didn't give up easily, especially when it came to matters of the family. "I don't know," Michael admitted, meeting Jack's eyes. "But if he does, we'll deal with it. I'm not letting him ruin this." Jack nodded, clapping Michael on the shoulder. "Well, whatever happens, I'm here for you, man. We all are." Michael smiled, grateful for his friend's support. "Thanks, Jack." As Jack left the room to join the other guests, Michael took one last look at himself in the mirror. His reflection stared back at him, but it was a different Michael than the one who had grown up in the shadow of his father. This Michael was his own man, standing on the edge of a new beginning. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the dressing room, ready to meet Emma at the altar. In a small room at the back of the church, Emma stood in front of a full-length mirror, smoothing down the fabric of her simple white dress. The dress wasn't elaborate or expensive, but it was perfect. It was a symbol of the life she and Michael were building together, a life that wasn't about wealth or status, but about love and partnership. Her heart raced with a mix of excitement and nerves as she glanced at her reflection. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, about to marry a man like Michael Harrison. It all felt like a dream. And yet, here she was. The door behind her creaked open, and Sarah, one of the housekeepers from the Harrison mansion and one of Emma's closest friends, stepped inside. "You look beautiful, Emma," Sarah said with a warm smile. Emma turned to face her friend, feeling a wave of emotion rise in her chest. "I can't believe this is really happening." Sarah crossed the room and took Emma's hands in hers. "It's happening. You deserve this." Emma nodded, though her mind drifted to Michael's father. She couldn't shake the fear that William would somehow try to interfere. He had made his feelings about their relationship clear, and his threats had been real. "What if he shows up?" Emma asked quietly, voicing the fear that had been haunting her. Sarah squeezed her hands reassuringly. "Even if he does, you and Michael are stronger than anything he could throw at you. You've already made it this far. Don't let him ruin today." Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. Sarah was right. She had faced so much already, and she wasn't about to let William Harrison take away her happiness. Not today. A knock at the door signaled that it was time. Emma glanced in the mirror one last time before turning to Sarah. "Let's do this." The church was filled with the soft murmur of friends and staff members, all there to witness the union of Michael and Emma. Though the guest list was small, the air was thick with love and support. Michael stood at the altar, his heart pounding with anticipation as the music began to play. Then, the doors opened, and there she was. Emma stood framed by the soft light filtering in through the church doors, her simple white dress flowing gently as she took her first step down the aisle. Michael's breath caught in his throat. She was radiant, and for a moment, everything else faded away. As she walked toward him, her eyes locked on his, Michael felt a surge of emotion. This was it. The moment they had fought for. The moment that would change everything. When Emma reached the altar, Michael took her hands in his, smiling down at her with a mix of love and awe. The minister began the ceremony, but Michael barely heard the words. All he could focus on was Emma, her eyes, her smile, the way her hands felt in his. The vows were exchanged, and with each promise, Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was the life he had chosen. This was the woman he wanted to spend forever with. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister said, his voice echoing in the quiet church. "You may kiss the bride." Michael didn't hesitate. He leaned in, pressing his lips to Emma's in a kiss that was filled with love, relief, and hope. The guests clapped and cheered, but all Michael could think about was the woman in his arms. As they pulled apart, smiling at each other, Michael felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. But as they turned to face their friends and family, the doors of the church creaked open once more. And there, standing in the doorway, was William Harrison. The joyful applause that had filled the small church moments before fell into a sudden, chilling silence. All eyes turned toward the entrance, where William Harrison stood like a ghost from a nightmare. His sharp, calculating gaze swept the room, and the air grew heavy with tension. Michael's heart sank at the sight of his father, his mind racing with thoughts of what he could possibly want now. Emma stiffened beside him, her hand tightening around his as she instinctively drew closer. Michael glanced at her, giving her a reassuring squeeze, but he felt the knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. This was supposed to be their moment, untouched by the shadow of his father's control. But William had come, and with him, the threat of everything unraveling. William stepped further into the church, the sound of his polished shoes echoing on the stone floor. The guests whispered in hushed tones, unsure of what to do, their faces reflecting a mix of confusion and unease. "Michael." William's voice was cold and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. "We need to talk." Michael's jaw clenched as he turned to face his father, keeping Emma's hand firmly in his. "There's nothing left to talk about, Dad. You made your position clear." William's gaze flicked briefly to Emma, then back to Michael, his expression hardening. "You think you know everything, but you don't. You're making a mistake, one that could ruin both your lives." Michael felt his blood boil at his father's audacity. "I've already made my choice, and I'm not turning back." William took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. This isn't just about the business or the family name. It's about her," he said, gesturing toward Emma. Emma flinched slightly at his words, her brow furrowing in confusion. Michael stood his ground, his voice laced with anger. "Don't you dare talk about her like that." William stepped closer, lowering his voice, but the weight of his words was unmistakable. "She isn't who you think she is." Emma's face paled, and Michael's stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" Michael demanded, his voice rising. William's eyes locked onto Emma, and the room seemed to close in around them. "Emma," he began slowly, his tone almost eerily calm. "Did your mother ever tell you the truth about your father?" Emma froze, her eyes wide as she shook her head. "No, she never talked about him." William nodded slightly, his lips curling into a grim smile. "That's because she was hiding something, a secret that changes everything." Michael's grip tightened around Emma's hand as his heart raced. He didn't like where this was going, and every instinct screamed for him to stop his father from speaking. But it was too late. William's gaze hardened, his next words dropping like a bombshell. "Emma, you're my daughter." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The shock hit Michael like a wave, leaving him breathless. He blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. But the words didn't make sense. They couldn't make sense. Emma staggered back, her face drained of color as the weight of the revelation crashed down on her. No, that's not possible," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Her voice trembled with fear and confusion, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Michael's mind raced, desperately trying to grasp the implications. He stared at his father, searching his face for some sign that this was all a sick joke. But William's expression remained cold and unwavering. "This can't be true," Michael muttered, his voice strained. "You're lying." "I wish I were," William replied, his tone devoid of emotion. "Years ago, I had a relationship with your mother, Emma. She worked for the family, just like you. When she got pregnant, I was young, ambitious. I didn't want to jeopardize my future, so I walked away. I gave her money and made sure she stayed quiet, but she never told you the truth. You are my daughter." Emma's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her hands covering her face as the full horror of the situation washed over her. Michael knelt beside her, his own emotions a tangled mess of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. The guests in the church remained frozen in their seats, stunned into silence. The moment that was supposed to be a celebration of love had turned into a nightmare. Michael felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under him, and all the plans they had made for their future together were suddenly shattered. "Dad." Michael's voice was barely above a whisper, filled with both disbelief and fury. "Why now? Why are you doing this now?" William took a deep breath, his gaze softening slightly, though it did nothing to ease the pain of his revelation. "Because I couldn't let you go through with this. You had to know the truth before it was too late." Michael shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "Too late. It's already too late. He stopped, the realization crashing down on him. They had already exchanged vows. They were already married. He looked down at Emma, who was still trembling on the floor, unable to speak. His heart broke for her. This woman he loved with every fiber of his being, who had just discovered that their love was tainted by an unspeakable truth. The silence that followed was unbearable. Michael couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to look at his father again. Everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, felt like it had been ripped away from him in an instant. Emma finally found her voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "Michael, what are we going to do?" Michael's throat tightened, and for the first time, he didn't have an answer. The world around them seemed to spin out of control, and all he could do was hold on to Emma as if somehow, by holding her, he could keep them both from falling apart. But deep down, he knew that everything had already changed. The quiet in the church was oppressive. The weight of the revelation had sunk into every corner of the room, pressing down on everyone. Emma's tears flowed freely as she sat on the cold floor, her body trembling with shock. Michael remained by her side, holding her, but inside, he felt like he was unraveling. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts he couldn't organize. How could this be true? How could his father have kept such a terrible secret? Michael's heart pounded in his chest, every beat a reminder of the impossibility of the situation. He and Emma were married, thinking they had escaped the suffocating grip of William Harrison. But now, the very foundation of their love had been torn apart by this devastating truth. William stood at the front of the church, looking down at the broken couple with a strange detachment. His face was set, unmoved by the emotional devastation he had caused. It was as if this was all just another business transaction to him, something to be managed, not felt. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. The guests, once full of joy, now sat frozen in their seats, unsure of how to react. The awkward shuffling, the whispers of disbelief, all seemed distant to Michael. All he could focus on was Emma, her pain, her confusion, her heartbreak. Finally, Michael stood up, his body heavy with the weight of what he had to do. He turned to face his father, his eyes blazing with anger, with betrayal. "How could you?" His voice trembled with rage. "How could you keep something like this from me? Keep it from her!" William didn't flinch. "It wasn't relevant until now." "Not relevant," Michael spat, his fists clenching at his sides. "You let us fall in love, you let us get married, and you say it's not relevant." William's jaw tightened, and he stepped forward, his voice calm but cold. "I didn't let you do anything, Michael. You made your own choices, defied my wishes. This is the consequence of your actions." Emma looked up from where she sat, her eyes red and swollen. "Why?" she whispered, her voice small, fragile. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't my mother tell me?" William hesitated for a moment before answering, his tone slightly softer. "Your mother wanted to protect you. She didn't want you to grow up with the stigma of being an illegitimate child. She thought it was better if you never knew." Emma shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Better? How could this possibly be better?" Michael knelt beside her again, his hand reaching for hers, but Emma pulled away, her body shaking with sobs. The distance between them, physical and emotional, seemed to grow with every passing second. I can't believe this is happening," she cried, her voice barely audible. "I loved you, Michael. I thought we could have a life together. But now, how can we after this?" Michael's chest tightened. Her words felt like a knife twisting in his heart, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to fix this. He had always been the one to protect her, to reassure her. But now he had no answers. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. "Emma, please. We'll figure this out. We'll get through this. I love you. That hasn't changed." Emma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "But everything else has changed. Everything." The weight of her words hung between them like a heavy fog. Michael knew she was right, but the idea of losing her, of their love being tainted by something so monstrous, was unbearable. As the room remained engulfed in tension, William stepped forward again, his eyes cold as ice. "This is exactly why I didn't want you involved with her, Michael. Your entire life has been a series of calculated decisions, ones that would ensure your success, your future. I didn't want you throwing it all away on a girl who would only bring you ruin." Michael's anger flared again, but this time it was laced with something deeper, something that came from the pit of his soul. "This isn't about success or the company or your damned legacy, Dad. This is about me. This is about love. Something you clearly don't understand." William's face remained expressionless. "Love is a fleeting emotion, Michael. It doesn't last. What lasts is power, influence, control." Michael stared at his father, his eyes filled with contempt. "That's all you care about, isn't it? Control. You've spent your entire life controlling everyone around you. Me, Mom, Emma. But you can't control this." William's mouth tightened into a thin line, but he said nothing. He had never understood his son's need for independence, for love beyond the material. And now, standing there in the ruins of Michael's dream, William seemed almost indifferent to the destruction he had caused. Michael turned back to Emma, desperation in his voice. "Emma, I don't care about what he says. I don't care about the past. We can still be together. We can fight this." Emma's eyes met his, but they were filled with doubt, with sorrow. "How, Michael? How can we fight something like this? We're siblings." Her voice broke as she said the word, and the weight of it nearly crushed Michael. He reached for her hand again, but she pulled away once more, standing shakily on her feet. "I need time," she whispered, barely able to hold herself together. "I need to think." Michael nodded, though his heart screamed against it. He watched as Emma walked out of the church, her steps unsteady, her world shattered. For the first time in his life, Michael felt completely lost. He turned back to William, his eyes filled with rage. "You've destroyed everything." William didn't respond, and Michael didn't wait for him to. He stormed past his father, leaving the church behind him. Outside, the sky was darkening, storm clouds gathering in the distance. It felt fitting, like the whole world was reflecting the chaos that had just unfolded. Michael looked up at the sky, the weight of his father's betrayal, Emma's heartbreak, and his own helplessness crashing down on him. He had no idea where to go from here. All he knew was that the life he had planned, the future he had fought for, had been torn apart in a single moment, and he wasn't sure if it could ever be put back together. The days after the wedding passed in a blur. Michael barely slept, his mind haunted by the events at the church and the devastating revelation that had turned his world upside down. He kept replaying the moment William had shattered everything, the look in Emma's eyes, the disbelief, the pain. He couldn't shake the feeling that there had to be more to the story. Something didn't add up. Michael sat in the empty kitchen of his apartment, the faint glow of dawn creeping in through the window. He stared at the cup of coffee in front of him, untouched. His thoughts tangled in a web of questions. Emma had asked for space, and he had given it to her, but the silence between them was deafening. It had been days since they had spoken, and he didn't know how long he could go on without hearing her voice. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact. A part of him wanted to call her, to beg her to come back, but he knew she needed time. They both did. Instead, he opened his browser and began searching for answers. Anything that could shed light on the twisted history his father had revealed. Hours passed as he combed through old documents, newspaper archives, and anything that might help him understand the truth about Emma's past. He knew his father well enough to know that the man was capable of manipulation, capable of bending the truth to suit his own needs. But what if this time, the truth was exactly as William had said, just as Michael was about to give up? A name caught his eye, an old employee of the Harrison family, a woman who had worked as a housekeeper around the time William claimed to have had his affair with Emma's mother. Her name was Margaret, and Michael remembered her vaguely from his childhood. She had been kind, always smiling, always with a warm word for him when he was a boy. If anyone knew the truth, it had to be her. With a newfound sense of purpose, Michael grabbed his keys and headed out the door. He needed answers, and Margaret was the only person who might have them. Later that day, Michael found himself standing outside a modest two-story house in a quiet suburb on the edge of town. The house was well kept, with flowers blooming in the front yard and a small porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. For a moment, Michael hesitated. He hadn't spoken to Margaret in years. Would she even remember him? More importantly, would she be willing to help him? Summoning his courage, he knocked on the door. A few moments later, the door opened, and there stood Margaret, her face lined with the years, but her eyes still bright and kind. She blinked in surprise at the sight of him. "Michael, is that really you?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Michael smiled, though it felt strained. "It's me, Margaret. I'm sorry to drop by like this, but I need your help. I don't know who else to turn to." Margaret stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Of course. Come in. I can't believe it's been so long. What's going on?" As they sat down in her cozy living room, Michael wasted no time explaining the situation. He told her everything, about his father's revelation at the wedding, about Emma, about the secrets that had torn their lives apart. Margaret listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each word. When Michael finished, she sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. "I knew about your father's relationship with Emma's mother," she said slowly, her voice tinged with sadness. "It was a scandal at the time, but your father was determined to keep it quiet. He paid her off, made sure she wouldn't talk. I always thought it was wrong, but there wasn't much I could do." Michael felt a pit form in his stomach. "So it's true. Emma's really his daughter." Margaret hesitated, her eyes meeting his. "That's what your father wanted everyone to believe. But there's something you don't know." Michael leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath, as if preparing herself to reveal something long hidden. "Your father didn't want to risk losing everything. So when Emma's mother found out she was pregnant, he made a deal with her. He gave her money and told her to leave. But there's one thing he didn't know. Emma wasn't his biological daughter. Michael froze, his mind racing to catch up with what Margaret had just said. What? But how? Emma's mother had been in a relationship before she met your father, Margaret explained. A man she loved deeply. When she found out she was pregnant, she knew the child wasn't William's, but she didn't want to tell him the truth. She took the money, disappeared, and raised Emma as if she were William's daughter. Michael sat back, his head spinning. This changed everything. Emma wasn't his half-sister. They weren't related by blood. But why didn't she tell Emma? Michael asked, still trying to wrap his mind around it all. Margaret shook her head. I don't know. Maybe she was afraid of what your father might do if he found out the truth. Or maybe she thought it was easier this way. I don't think anyone will ever know for sure. Michael felt a surge of relief wash over him, but it was quickly followed by a wave of anger. His father had manipulated them, played with their lives without knowing the full truth. And because of his lies, he and Emma had been torn apart. I have to tell Emma, Michael said, standing up. She deserves to know. Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with sympathy. Go to her, Michael. She needs you. Michael drove as fast as he could to Emma's apartment, his mind racing with the new information. His hands gripped the steering wheel, the urgency to fix everything burning inside him. He had to tell her. They weren't siblings. They could still be together. All the pain, all the heartbreak, it didn't have to destroy them. When he arrived at her building, he jumped out of the car and ran up the stairs to her door. His heart pounded in his chest as he knocked, praying that she would open it. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there she stood, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked at him, confused, but before she could say anything, Michael blurted out the words that had been burning inside him. Emma, you're not his daughter. You're not my sister. Her eyes widened, and Michael took a step closer, his voice filled with desperation. Your mother lied to him. You're not related to me. We can still be together. Emma's hand flew to her mouth as the shock of what he was saying hit her. She stared at him, speechless, as the reality of what he had just told her began to sink in. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, staring at Michael as if he had just spoken in a language she couldn't comprehend. His words echoed in her mind, but the weight of the revelation hadn't fully settled yet. She blinked, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words came. The possibility that everything they had been through, every tear, every moment of agony, was based on a lie seemed too overwhelming to process. Michael, she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you saying? Michael stepped forward, his eyes pleading with hers. I spoke to Margaret. She was a housekeeper for my family when we were kids. She knew about my father's relationship with your mother, but there was more. Emma, your mother wasn't with him when she got pregnant. The man she loved before. He's your real father. Emma's heart raced, and she clung to the doorframe for support, her mind spinning. But my mother, she never said anything. She never told me. She was trying to protect you, Michael said softly, taking her hands in his. I don't know why she kept it from you for so long, but I swear to you, Emma, you and I, we're not related. We can still have our life together. Emma's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to catch up with the sudden change in their reality. Everything she had believed about her past, about her connection to Michael, had been turned upside down once again. Her chest tightened with a mixture of emotions: relief, confusion, disbelief. Are you sure? She asked, her voice small, barely audible. I'm sure, Michael said, his grip on her hands tightening. We were lied to, but none of it matters now, Emma. What matters is that we can move forward. We don't have to live in the shadow of my father's mistakes anymore. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as the reality of his words began to sink in. They weren't bound by the horrific revelation that had torn them apart. They weren't siblings. The life they had envisioned together wasn't lost after all. But with the relief came a flood of emotions. Anger at her mother for hiding the truth, resentment toward William for manipulating their lives, and above all, a deep, aching sadness for the time they had lost. Emma pulled her hands away from Michael's and took a step back, her eyes glistening with tears. But Michael, even if we're not related, I don't know how to move past everything. I don't know if I can just forget what happened, what we went through. Michael's face softened with understanding. I'm not asking you to forget, Emma. I know it's not that simple, but I love you. I've always loved you. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. We've been through so much, but we can come out stronger. Emma wiped her eyes, her heart aching. I thought I lost you. When your father said those words in the church, I felt like my whole world collapsed. Michael nodded, his own heart heavy with the memory. I felt the same way. But we can rebuild, Emma. We can start over. A heavy silence fell between them as Emma struggled to reconcile her feelings. She had loved Michael fiercely, with all of her heart. But the pain they had endured over the past days had left scars she wasn't sure would ever fully heal. And yet, the thought of walking away from him now, after learning that they could be together after all, felt impossible. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. I don't know if I can just pretend like none of this happened. I don't know if I can trust that things will ever be the same. Michael's expression was filled with pain, but also with determination. I'm not asking you to pretend, Emma. And I'm not saying things will go back to the way they were. But we have a chance. A real chance to build something new. Together. Emma's tears flowed freely now, her emotions warring inside her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could find their way back to each other, but the hurt still lingered. And she didn't know if she could let go of the fear that something else would come along and tear them apart again. I need time, she said, her voice breaking. Michael's shoulders slumped slightly, but he nodded. I understand. I'll give you all the time you need. Emma stepped back further into the apartment, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She looked at Michael, standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with hope and pain. She wanted so badly to reach out to him, to tell him that everything would be okay. But she wasn't ready yet. I'll call you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael nodded, though the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Take as long as you need. With that, Emma gently closed the door, leaving Michael standing on the other side. She leaned against it, her body trembling as the tears flowed freely down her cheeks. She wasn't sure what to do, or how to feel. All she knew was that her heart was still in pieces, and she needed time to put it back together. Michael stood outside the apartment door for a long moment, his mind swirling with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. He had come here hoping that the truth would be enough to fix everything, that once Emma knew they weren't related, they could simply pick up the pieces and move on. But it wasn't that simple. He walked down the stairs slowly, his hands shoved into his pockets as he replayed the conversation in his head. He couldn't blame Emma for needing time. They had both been through hell, and it would take more than just a revelation to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Still, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The truth was out now. They weren't bound by the chains of William's lies, and that meant there was a chance, no matter how small, that they could find their way back to each other. As Michael reached his car, he glanced back at the apartment one last time. His heart ached with longing, but he knew he had to be patient. Emma needed space to process everything, and he was willing to give her that, no matter how hard it was to wait. For now, all he could do was hope that, in time, she would realize that they still had a future worth fighting for. Michael sat in his car outside of Emma's apartment for what felt like an eternity. The weight of the past days still pressed heavily on his chest, and though a sense of hope had blossomed, there was unfinished business. He knew what he had to do next. He had to confront his father. The truth about Emma's parentage had set him free from the fear that their love was forbidden, but the damage William had caused still lingered. The ride back to the Harrison mansion felt different this time. It wasn't filled with the tension of defiance or the uncertainty of his future with Emma. Now, there was clarity. William's manipulation had caused irreparable harm, but Michael wasn't going to let his father keep controlling his life. Not anymore. When Michael pulled up to the mansion, the familiar sight of its towering columns and expansive grounds didn't intimidate him the way it once had. Instead, it filled him with a kind of calm determination. This was just a house, and William Harrison was just a man, flawed, selfish, and far less powerful than he liked to believe. Michael walked through the front doors without hesitation, his footsteps echoing through the grand foyer. The house was silent, but he knew exactly where to find his father. He made his way to William's study, the place where all of his father's deals, threats, and manipulations took root. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, Michael could see his father sitting behind the large oak desk, poring over some documents. The sight made Michael's stomach turn. Even after everything, William was still trying to maintain control over the business, over his legacy, over Michael's life. Without knocking, Michael pushed the door open and stepped inside. William glanced up, his expression unreadable as he set the papers aside. "Michael," he said, his voice steady. "I wasn't expecting you." Michael didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, letting the tension between them build. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I know the truth, Dad." William raised an eyebrow, his face betraying nothing. "And what truth might that be?" "Emma isn't your daughter," Michael said, his words sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "She never was." William's eyes flickered for just a moment, surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. But he quickly recovered, leaning back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of him. "You've been doing your homework, I see." Michael took a step forward, his anger barely contained. "Why? Why did you let us believe that lie? Why did you destroy everything we had, knowing you didn't even have the full story?" William sighed, standing up and walking toward the window, his back to Michael. "I did what I thought was necessary. You've always been too emotional, too attached to the wrong things. I had to make you see reason." "Reason?" Michael scoffed, his fists clenching at his sides. "You call tearing apart people's lives reason?" William turned to face him, his expression cold, controlled. "I did what I had to do to protect this family, Michael. To protect you." "From what?" Michael demanded, his voice rising. "From love? From happiness? You've been trying to control me my entire life. And for what? So you can protect your precious empire." William's eyes darkened, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't understand what it takes to run this empire. You've lived in a world of privilege, Michael, but you don't know the sacrifices I've had to make to keep it alive." Michael stepped closer, his anger boiling over. "Sacrifices? You sacrificed my happiness, my future with Emma. For what? For money? For power? You didn't protect me, you destroyed me." William stared at him, his jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. "You let us suffer," Michael continued, his voice cracking with emotion. "You let us believe we couldn't be together because of some twisted lie you created. You broke us." William's gaze finally faltered, his eyes softening for just a moment. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know she wasn't mine." Michael's chest tightened with fury. "But you didn't care enough to find out, did you? You didn't care about the truth, as long as it meant getting your way." William turned away again, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. For the first time, Michael saw something in his father that he hadn't seen before: regret. But even if William felt it, it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the damage that had been done. "I was wrong," William admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought if I kept you away from her, you'd come back to the family. I didn't want to lose you, Michael." Michael's anger flared again, his voice filled with bitterness. "You didn't want to lose control of me, you mean?" William looked up, his face pale, his expression strained. "I did what I thought was best for you." Michael shook his head, stepping back. "No, Dad. You did what was best for you. And now you've lost me anyway." The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. William stood there, his hands trembling slightly as he realized the full weight of his actions. Michael had always been his son, the heir to his empire, the one he had groomed to carry on the Harrison name. But now, that future was gone. The bond between them had been shattered beyond repair. Michael took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I'm done, Dad. I'm done letting you control me. Emma and we're not related. We're going to be together, and there's nothing you can do to stop that." William's face tightened, but he didn't argue. He could see the resolve in Michael's eyes, the strength that had grown from the pain he had endured. "And as for your empire," Michael continued, his voice calm but firm, "I want no part of it. You can have your legacy. I don't need it. I don't want it." William's shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Michael saw the man for what he truly was, broken, flawed, and alone. "You can keep everything," Michael said quietly, turning toward the door. "But you've lost the only thing that ever really mattered." As Michael walked out of the study, leaving his father behind, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had confronted the man who had controlled his life for so long, and now he was free to live the life he wanted. Free to love Emma without the weight of lies and manipulation hanging over them. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt like he could breathe again. The cool night air brushed against Michael's skin as he left the mansion behind, his father's empire now a distant memory. The confrontation had drained him, but it had also freed him in ways he hadn't expected. William's hold on him was gone, and with that weight lifted, he could finally think clearly. His thoughts immediately turned to Emma, to the future they could still build together. Michael reached for his phone as soon as he got into his car, hesitating for only a moment before dialing Emma's number. It rang once, twice, and then he heard her voice, soft, tentative. "Michael?" Hearing her speak his name brought a rush of emotions he hadn't fully processed. Relief, hope, love. They all flooded through him. "Emma," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I talked to my father. I know it doesn't change what we've been through, but I told him everything. I'm done with him. I'm done with the business. I'm choosing you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Michael held his breath, waiting for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but there was a hint of something else there, maybe the beginnings of healing. "I've been thinking a lot," Emma said, "about us, about everything. It's been so hard to understand, to know what's real and what isn't." Michael nodded, even though she couldn't see him. He understood that completely. "I know. I don't expect everything to just go back to normal overnight, but I'm willing to work through it, if you are. I want to be with you, Emma. I want to build something real with you, without my father's lies hanging over us." Emma sighed softly on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Michael's heart raced with the fear that she might not feel the same. But then she spoke, and the weight of her words began to lift the cloud that had hung over them for so long. "I want that too, Michael, but I'm scared. Everything that happened, it hurt me so much. I don't know if I can just forget it all." Michael's chest tightened. He didn't want her to forget. It wasn't about pretending the pain hadn't existed. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said gently. I'm asking you to let me help heal it. Let's start over, but this time with the truth." There was another long pause, but this time, it felt less heavy, more thoughtful. Emma took a deep breath. "Can we meet? I don't want to talk about this over the phone. I need to see you." Michael's heart leapt at her words, and without hesitation, he answered, "Of course, I'll be there in 10 minutes." When Michael arrived at Emma's apartment, his nerves felt as raw as they had on their wedding day. But this time, it wasn't about fear or doubt. It was about the possibility of rebuilding something beautiful, something real. He knocked on the door, and after what felt like an eternity, it swung open to reveal Emma, standing there with a hesitant smile. "Hi," she said softly, her eyes searching his face for answers to the questions she hadn't yet asked. "Hi," Michael replied, his own smile filled with both relief and longing. He stepped inside, and they stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "It's been hard for me to process everything. When your father said what he did at the wedding, I felt like my whole world collapsed. I didn't know how to feel about you, about us." Michael nodded, understanding the pain she had been through. "I know, it was the same for me, but Emma, you're not alone in this. I've been lost too. But now that we know the truth, I'm not going to let anything tear us apart again." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away. "I just don't know how to move past the hurt. It felt so real. The betrayal, the fear that we were something we shouldn't have been." "I get that," Michael said softly, "and I know it's not something that will heal overnight. But I love you, Emma. I always have. And I'm willing to take things as slow as you need. We can figure this out together." Emma wiped her eyes, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I don't want to lose you, Michael. Even with everything that's happened, I still love you. I never stopped loving you. I need to trust that this time it's real." "It's real," Michael said, his voice filled with conviction. "There's no more secrets, no more lies. We have a clean slate, Emma. We can make this work." Emma's lips trembled as she smiled through her tears. "I want to believe that." Michael stepped closer, reaching for her hands. This time, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let him hold her, their fingers intertwining like they always had, as if the time apart hadn't existed. It felt like coming home, a place they both belonged. "I'll prove it to you every day if that's what it takes," Michael whispered, his forehead resting gently against hers. "We'll take it one step at a time." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Okay, let's try." Michael smiled, the relief washing over him like a tidal wave. "We'll try." They stood there for a moment longer, just holding each other, letting the silence between them speak of the love they hadn't lost, only buried beneath the weight of lies. And now, with the truth finally out, they could begin to rebuild, slowly, carefully, but with a future that was no longer clouded by doubt or deception. Later that evening, they sat together on the small couch in Emma's living room, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. There was a lightness between them that hadn't been there in weeks, a sense of hope that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay after all. "I'm leaving my father's business," Michael said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I told him I don't want any part of it anymore." Emma looked at him, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "Are you sure? That's a big decision." Michael nodded. "I'm sure. I want to start fresh, without his influence hanging over me, over us." Emma smiled softly, her heart swelling with pride. "I think that's a good decision." Michael reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure this out together, Emma, whatever it takes." She squeezed his hand back, a feeling of peace settling over her. For the first time in a long time, she believed him. The days that followed were a blur of tentative steps forward, slow but meaningful. Michael and Emma spent hours talking, rediscovering parts of each other that had been overshadowed by the whirlwind of events. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt and lingering pain, but they were committed to healing, to rebuilding the relationship that had been shattered by lies and manipulation. Michael had left the Harrison mansion behind, along with his father's empire, choosing instead to start fresh. It wasn't easy walking away from the legacy that had defined his life for so long. But the more distance he put between himself and his father's world, the more he realized how much lighter he felt. He didn't miss the pressure, the expectations, or the endless striving for something that had never truly belonged to him. What mattered now was the life he could create with Emma. One afternoon, Michael and Emma decided to take a walk along the Charles River. The late autumn air was crisp, the leaves turning vibrant shades of red and gold. As they strolled along the path, the tension that had once hung between them seemed to have eased, replaced by a quiet understanding of where they had been and where they were going. Emma glanced at Michael, her hand gently brushing against his as they walked. "How do you feel about everything? I mean, it's been a lot, all of it." Michael gave her a small smile, his eyes soft as he looked at her. "I feel free, I guess. I thought leaving everything behind would be harder, but it's not. It feels right." Emma nodded, her heart swelling with pride for him. She had seen the weight that his father's expectations had placed on him, how much it had defined every decision he made. But now, without that burden, Michael seemed more at peace, more himself than she had ever known. "And you?" Michael asked, his tone gentle. "How are you feeling?" Emma sighed softly, her breath visible in the cool air. "I'm still processing it all, to be honest. I mean, it's hard to just let go of everything we went through. But I'm hopeful, more than I've been in a long time." Michael stopped walking, turning to face her. His hands found hers, and he looked into her eyes with a seriousness that made her heart skip a beat. "I know it'll take time, and I know we can't undo what happened, but I'm here for you, Emma, for whatever you need, however long it takes. I love you, and that hasn't changed." Emma's lips curved into a soft smile, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of certainty. "I love you too, Michael." They stood there for a moment, the world around them quiet and peaceful, as if it were giving them the space to breathe, to heal. The weight of their past still lingered, but it no longer felt like an insurmountable obstacle. It was simply part of their journey, something they would carry with them, but not something that would define them. Back at Emma's apartment later that evening, they sat together on the couch, the glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room. Michael held her hand, tracing small circles on her palm with his thumb, the silence between them comfortable and easy. "I've been thinking about what's next," Michael said, his voice thoughtful. Emma tilted her head, curious. "What do you mean?" "Well, I've left my father's business, and I want to figure out what comes next for me. For us," Michael explained. "I've been so focused on living the life my father wanted that I never really thought about what I want. And now, I get to do that." Emma smiled, squeezing his hand. "That's exciting. Have you thought about what you want to do?" Michael chuckled softly, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, I have no idea. But that's the exciting part, right? For the first time, it's up to me." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full of warmth. "I'm proud of you, Michael. It takes a lot of courage to walk away from something like that." "I couldn't have done it without you," Michael said, his voice sincere. "You've shown me what really matters. It's not about money or power, it's about love, about the people we care about. And that's what I want to focus on now, building something real." Emma lifted her head, meeting his gaze. then we'll build it together." Michael smiled, the weight of their journey no longer feeling like a burden. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something new, something they would create together, without the ghosts of the past haunting them. The weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, Michael and Emma found their rhythm. They spent time exploring new possibilities, dreaming of a future that was theirs alone. Michael took a step back from the corporate world, finding fulfillment in simpler things, while Emma embraced her passion for helping others, exploring the idea of starting a small nonprofit organization focused on supporting underprivileged women. Their relationship, once fractured by lies and secrets, grew stronger with each passing day. They learned to communicate better, to trust more deeply, and to let go of the fear that had once dominated their lives. One afternoon, they returned to the small church where they had exchanged their vows. The memory of that day still lingered, but now it felt different. It wasn't tainted by the pain of the past. It was a reminder of how far they had come. Standing outside the church, Emma looked up at Michael, her eyes bright with emotion. "It's strange being back here, isn't it?" Michael nodded, his own emotions bubbling to the surface. "Yeah, it is, but it feels different now, like we've reclaimed it." Emma smiled, taking his hand. "We have." They stood there for a moment, the church bells ringing softly in the distance, the sun setting on the horizon. It was a new beginning, one they had fought hard for, and now it was theirs. As they walked away from the church, hand in hand, they both knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Because in the end, love had prevailed.